Picture this for a moment. You've just started a new job. The hours are long, the work is demanding, but you're finally settling into a routine. Everything feels normal. You know exactly what to expect each day, or in this case, each night. But then something starts happening that doesn't belong in your carefully ordered world. Something so subtle you almost dismiss it at first. A sound that shouldn't be there. A pattern that makes no sense. And slowly, you begin to realize that your quiet, peaceful workplace might be harboring something that refuses to rest. This story comes from Osaka, from the sterile corridors of a hospital where healing and hope should be the only constants. But some places hold on to more than just memories. Some places become home to those who never truly left. What I'm about to share with you isn't just another ghost story from Japan. It's an account of how the boundary between duty and obsession can blur, especially when that duty extends beyond death itself. Tonight, we're going to follow Rina Takahashi through her first weeks at Aoba General Hospital, where she discovered that some nurses never really finish their final rounds. And once you hear her story, you might never look at those quiet hospital corridors the same way again. Rina Takahashi had always preferred the night shift. There was something peaceful about the hospital after dark, when the chaos of the day gave way to a gentler rhythm. The fluorescent lights seemed softer somehow, the endless stream of visitors and phone calls reduced to a whisper. At 27, she'd worked in enough medical facilities to know that the night hours suited her temperament perfectly. Less drama, fewer interruptions, and the satisfaction of watching over patients as they slept peacefully under her care. When she accepted the position at Aoba General Hospital, a mid-sized facility in a quiet district of Osaka, Rina felt like she'd found exactly what she was looking for. The building itself was older, built sometime in the 1960s, but it had been well maintained. The corridors were wide and clean, lined with that particular shade of pale green paint that seemed to be universal to medical facilities. Her supervisor, Mrs. Yamamoto, was kind but professional, and her colleagues on the day shift seemed genuinely welcoming during the brief overlap periods when they shared updates. The hospital specialized in long-term care, which meant many of their patients stayed for weeks or even months at a time. Rina found this aspect of the work particularly rewarding. Unlike the emergency departments where she'd worked before, here she could develop real relationships with the patients, learning their preferences, their fears, their small daily routines that made hospital life more bearable. Her section was the third floor, which housed about 20 rooms. Most were semi-private, but there were a few singles at the far end of the corridor for patients who required extra attention or privacy. Room 305 sat at the very end of the hall, past the nurse's station, past the supply closet, in a spot that felt somehow separate from the rest of the floor. For her first week, Rina threw herself into learning the routines. She memorized medication schedules, familiarized herself with each patient's needs, and gradually found her rhythm in the peaceful hours between midnight and dawn. The other night, staff consisted of just one other nurse, Keiko, who worked the opposite end of the building, and a security guard who made rounds every few hours, but mostly stayed at his desk in the lobby. It was during her second week that Rina first noticed the sound. She was updating charts at the nurse's station when she heard it. 3 soft knocks, evenly spaced, coming from the direction of room 305. The sound was gentle, almost polite, like someone requesting permission to enter rather than demanding attention. Rina looked up from her paperwork and listened. The hallway was quiet, except for the usual background hum of medical equipment and the occasional rustle of a patient shifting in their sleep. She assumed one of the patients was awake and needed assistance, though she couldn't recall anyone being assigned to that particular room at the moment. She walked down the corridor, her soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper against the polished floor. When she reached room 305, she found the door closed and no light underneath visible. She knocked gently and called out in a low voice, not wanting to wake anyone unnecessarily. "Hello? Did someone need assistance?" Silence. She waited for a moment, then carefully opened the door. The room was empty, just as she'd expected. The bed was made with crisp white sheets, the side table clear except for a water pitcher and glass that housekeeping had left for next patient. The window overlooked the small garden courtyard, where security cast long shadows between lights the carefully maintained shrubs. Rina closed the door and returned to her station, making a mental note to ask maintenance about the building's acoustics. Old buildings had their quirks, and she'd worked in enough of them to know that pipes and settling foundations could create all sorts of unexpected sounds. But the next night, at almost exactly the same time, she heard it again. 3 knocks, soft and measured, from the same direction. This time, she was more curious than concerned. She'd been working nights long enough to develop a healthy skepticism about mysterious sounds. Usually, they had perfectly rational explanations. Again, she walked to room 305. Again, she found it empty and undisturbed. But as she stood in the doorway, something felt different. The air in the room seemed cooler than the hallway, and there was a faint scent she couldn't quite identify. Not unpleasant, but somehow familiar in a way that made her pause. The following morning, during the shift change, Rina mentioned the knocking to Keiko, thinking perhaps she'd heard it too from her end of the building. "Knocking on 305? Keiko looked puzzled. "That room Endo passed last month. Ours been empty since, Mr. You sure it was coming from there?" "I'm pretty sure," Rina said. "It happened twice now, around 3 in the morning. 3 knocks. Very soft." Keiko frowned. "That's odd. I haven't heard anything like that. Maybe it's something in the walls. This old building makes all kinds of noises." Mrs. Yamamoto, who was reviewing the night reports nearby, looked up with interest. "Mr. Endo was in 305 for almost 6 months before he passed. Lovely man, very polite. He used to knock on his bedside table when he needed something instead of using the call button. Said he didn't want to be a bother." The information should have been reassuring, a logical explanation for the sound Rina had been hearing. Buildings held onto sound sometimes, echoes of past activities that seemed to repeat themselves. But instead of feeling relieved, Rina found herself oddly unsettled by the coincidence. That night, she found herself paying extra attention to the area around room 305. She made her regular rounds, checking on patients, dispensing medications, updating charts. Everything proceeded normally until about 2:30 in the morning. She was organizing supply inventory when she became aware of a change in the atmosphere of the floor. It was subtle, like the moment before a storm when the air pressure shifts and you know something is coming. At exactly 3 o'clock, she heard the knocking again. 3 measured taps, soft but unmistakably deliberate. This time, instead of investigating immediately, Rina remained at her station and listened carefully. The sound was definitely coming from the direction of room 305, but now that she was paying closer attention, something about the rhythm struck her as almost ceremonial, not the random knocking of settling pipes or thermal expansion, but something with intention behind it. She walked slowly down the corridor, her footsteps echoing slightly in the quiet space. As she approached room 305, she noticed that the door was standing slightly ajar. She was certain she'd closed it properly during her earlier rounds. Hospital policy was strict about keeping unoccupied rooms secured. Rina pushed the door open carefully and stepped inside. The room looked exactly as it had before, neat and ready for the next patient. But as she stood there in the doorway, she heard something that made her blood run cold. From somewhere in the hallway behind her came the soft sound of footsteps, measured and purposeful, moving away from where she stood. She spun around quickly, expecting to see Keiko or perhaps the security guard making his rounds, but the corridor stretched empty in both directions, lit only by the dim nighttime lighting that cast long shadows between the doorways. The footsteps had stopped the moment she turned, as if whoever had been walking had simply vanished into the sterile air. Rina stood frozen in the empty corridor, her heart hammering against her ribs. The silence that followed the phantom footsteps was somehow more unsettling than the sound itself. She waited there for what felt like several minutes, sure that someone else aiming to hear any indication was moving through the building. But the night had returned to its usual quiet symphony of distant medical equipment and the barely audible whisper of the ventilation system. She forced herself to walk back to the nurse's station, checking each room along the way. Every door was properly closed, every patient accounted for, and sleeping peacefully. There was no sign that anyone had been walking in the corridor, yet she couldn't shake the certainty that she'd heard those footsteps, measured and deliberate, moving away from room 305 the moment she'd entered. The rest of her shift passed without incident, but Rina found herself glancing frequently toward the far end of the corridor. Each time she looked, everything appeared normal. The hallway remained empty, lit by the soft glow of the night lighting, stretching away into shadows that seemed no different than any other night. But there was something in the air now, a tension that hadn't been there before, as if the very atmosphere of the floor had shifted. When Keiko arrived for the morning overlap, Rina almost didn't mention what had happened. How could she explain that she'd heard someone walking away from an empty room without sounding paranoid or overtired? But as they went through the patient reports together, she found herself unable to concentrate fully on the routine updates. "You look tired," Keiko observed, glancing at her with concern. "Everything all right with the night shift?" "Just still adjusting," Rina replied, though that wasn't entirely true anymore. She'd adjusted to the routines within days. This was something else entirely. Over the next few nights, Rina developed a new routine of her own. She began timing her rounds more carefully, noting exactly when she passed each section of the floor. She wanted to establish a clear pattern of where she was and when, hoping to make sense of what she'd been experiencing. If there was a logical explanation for the sounds and the footsteps, she was determined to find it. But the knocking continued, always at 3 in the morning, always 3 soft taps from the direction of room 305. Sometimes she would be at the far end of the floor when it happened, organizing medications in the supply room. Other times she would be right at the nurse's station, close enough that the sound seemed to come from just a few meters away. The consistency was unnerving. Whatever was causing it operated with a precision that defied explanation. On Thursday night of her 3rd week, Rina decided to take a more systematic approach. She positioned herself at the nurse's station at 2:50, with a clear view down the corridor toward room 305. She had her watch in front of her, timing each minute as it passed. At exactly 3 o'clock, she heard the familiar 3 knocks, soft and measured as always. This time she moved immediately. She walked quickly but quietly down the corridor, reaching room 305 within 30 seconds of hearing the sound. The door stood slightly ajar, just as it had the previous time, but now, as she approached, she could hear something else, a faint rustling sound like fabric moving against fabric coming from inside the room. Rina paused at the threshold, her hand on the door handle. The rustling continued for a few more seconds, then stopped abruptly. She pushed the door open wider and stepped inside, switching on the overhead light as she did. The room was empty, but something was different. The bed, which housekeeping always left perfectly made, showed a subtle depression in the center, as if someone had been sitting on the edge. The water glass on the bedside table, which she was certain had been full during her earlier rounds, was now half empty, and on the small table beside the window there was something that hadn't been there before. A patient chart, old and yellowed, with the hospital's previous logo printed at the top. The name on the cover read, Ichiro Endo, written in careful handwriting that belonged to an era when forms were still filled out by hand. Rina opened it carefully, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned the pages. The entries chronicled 6 months of medical care, documenting a gradual decline in health that had ultimately proven irreversible. But what struck her most was the pattern of notes throughout the chart. Every entry mentioned the patient's politeness, his consideration for the staff, his habit of knocking softly on his bedside table rather than using the call button when he needed assistance. Patient continues to demonstrate remarkable courtesy, read one entry from 3 months before his passing. Uses gentle knocking pattern to request attention, always apologetic for any inconvenience. Another entry from just 2 weeks before his death noted, Mr. Endo's knocking has become weaker, but maintains the same rhythm. 3 soft taps, then waits patiently for response. Rina closed the chart with shaking hands. The coincidence was too precise to dismiss. The timing, the rhythm, the location, everything aligned with what she'd been experiencing. But Mr. Endo had passed away over a month ago. The room had been thoroughly cleaned and prepared for the next patient. There was no logical reason for his chart to be here, much less for the sounds to continue. She looked around the room once more, noting details she hadn't paid attention to before. The window faced east toward the small garden courtyard that provided a view of trees and walking paths. During the day, it would be pleasant and peaceful, but now in the early hours before dawn, it looked out onto punked darkness, weighted only by the occasional security light. As she stood there trying to process what she'd discovered, Rina became aware of another sound. Footsteps in the corridor outside, moving slowly and deliberately toward the room. These were different from what she had heard before, heavier, more purposeful, with the slight drag of someone who might be having difficulty walking. She moved to the doorway and looked out into the hall. At first she saw nothing. The corridor stretched empty in both directions, lit by the same soft lighting that had become so familiar over the past few weeks. But then, at the very edge of her peripheral vision, she caught a glimpse of movement near the nurse's station. A figure in white was moving slowly down the hallway, walking with the careful gait of someone who was either very tired or in some discomfort. From this distance, Rina couldn't make out details, but the person appeared to be wearing a hospital gown and moved with the uncertain steps of a patient who shouldn't be out of bed unattended. Rina quickly stepped out of room 305 and walked toward the figure, her professional instincts over unease. Efforting her growing, one of the patients had gotten confused and was wandering the halls. She needed to help to their room before them. Back they hurt themselves. "Excuse me," she called softly, not wanting to startle whoever it was. "Can I help you get back to your room?" The figure stopped walking and turned slightly toward her. Even from a distance, Rina could see that something was wrong with the way the person moved. The turn was too slow, too deliberate, like someone moving through water rather than air, and there was something about the proportions that didn't quite look right, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what was troubling her about it. "Sir, you shouldn't be walking around without assistance," she called, picking up her pace as she moved down the corridor. "Let me help you back to bed." But as she got closer, the figure began to fade, not suddenly, like switching off a light, but gradually, as if it were made of mist that was slowly dissipating in a gentle breeze. Within seconds, there was nothing there at all, just the empty hallway and the soft hum of the building systems. Rina stood motionless in the spot where the figure had been, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She looked around frantically, checking every doorway, every corner where someone might have ducked out of sight. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that what she'd seen hadn't simply walked into another room. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't dealing with mysterious sounds or building acoustics or her own tired imagination. Something was happening on this floor that couldn't be explained by any rational means. The knocking, the footsteps, the figure in the hallway, they were all connected to room 305 and to the patient who had spent his final months there. She walked back to the nurse's station on unsteady legs, her mind struggling to process what she'd just witnessed. The fluorescent lights above seemed dimmer now, casting longer shadows between the doorways. Every small sound, hum seemed every mechanical amplified in the silence that followed her encounter. Rina sat down heavily in her chair and stared at the patient charts spread across her desk, but the words blurred together meaninglessly. She kept glancing toward the far end of the corridor, half expecting to see that figure in white materialize again from the shadows. The rational part of her mind searched desperately for explanations. Exhaustion, stress from the new job, maybe some kind of optical illusion created by the lighting. But deep down, she knew what she'd seen was real. The rest of that shift dragged by with agonizing slowness. Every routine task felt surreal, as if she were moving through a dream where the familiar had become foreign. When she checked on patients, their sleeping faces seemed more peaceful than before, almost serene in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of the expression she'd glimpsed on that fading figure. At 7 a.m, when the day shift began to arrive, Rina found herself reluctant to leave. The approaching daylight streaming through the windows felt like a protective barrier she wasn't ready to step away from, but she couldn't stay forever, and she couldn't explain to her colleagues why she was lingering without sounding completely unhinged. During the handoff with the morning nurse, Rina mentioned nothing about what she'd experienced. How could she? The woman would think she was having some kind of breakdown. Instead, she provided the standard updates about patient care and medication schedules, her voice sounding strangely distant to her own ears. But as she was gathering her things to leave, Mrs. Yamamoto approached her with a concerned expression. "Rina, you look exhausted. Are you adjusting to the night schedule all right?" "Yes, I think so," Rina replied, though the words felt hollow. "Just still getting used to the building, I suppose." Mrs. Yamamoto studied her for a moment. "You know, if you're having any unusual experiences, you shouldn't feel embarrassed to mention them. This is an old hospital, and sometimes new staff members notice things that seem strange until they understand the context." The phrasing was careful, almost as code if Mrs. Yamamoto was offering her an opening to discuss something that couldn't be addressed directly. "What kind of things?" Rina asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Well," Mrs. Yamamoto glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Sometimes the night shift can be quite isolating. The mind can play tricks when you're alone for long periods, but there have been occasions when staff members have reported experiences that seem to follow certain patterns." "Patterns?" "The hospital has a long history, Rina. We've cared for thousands of patients over the decades. Some of them formed very strong attachments to this place, to the routines, to the care they received. When people spend their final month somewhere, sometimes it can be difficult for them to let go completely." Mrs. Yamamoto's words hung in the air between them, unfinished but heavy with implication. Rina understood now that she wasn't the first to experience something unexplainable in these corridors, and perhaps, she realized with growing dread, she wouldn't be the last. The following weeks passed in a blur of sleepless days and increasingly tense nights. Rina found herself dreading the approach of 3 o'clock, yet unable to resist the pull toward room 305 when those familiar knocks echoed through the silence. Each night, the encounters became more vivid, more personal. The figure in white began appearing earlier, lingering longer, always just at the edge of her vision until she tried to approach. Then came the night when everything changed. Rina was making her rounds when she heard something different. Not the usual 3 knocks, but a voice calling her name softly from behind the door of room 305. Her own name, spoken with the same polite courtesy that had characterized Mr. Endo's interactions with the staff. When she opened the door this time, she found herself face to face with something that defied all rational explanation. Standing beside the bed was not the elderly patient she'd expected, but a figure in a nurse's uniform identical to her own. The woman's face was kind, but impossibly pale, her eyes holding a depth of exhaustion that seemed to span decades. "You've been working so hard," the figure said, her voice carrying that same familiar echo, "taking such good care of everyone. But who takes care of you?" Rina wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to do anything except stand there listening to this impossible conversation. But she found herself rooted in place, drawn by something in the other woman's expression that spoke of understanding, of shared burdens carried through endless nights. "Some duties don't end with a shift change," the figure continued, moving closer with each word. "Some responsibilities follow us beyond what we thought were our limits." Mr. Endo understood that. He spent his final months learning to let go, but some of us never learn that lesson. The truth hit Rina with horrifying clarity. This wasn't about Mr. Endo at all. This was about the nurse who had cared for him, who had worked these same corridors, who had died on duty and never truly left. The knocking hadn't been a patient requesting attention. It had been a colleague still making her rounds, still checking on her patients, still unable to rest. "You don't have to be alone anymore," the figure whispered, reaching out with hands that seemed to shimmer like water in moonlight. "The work never really ends, does it? There's always someone who needs care, always another round to make." Rina felt herself nodding, understanding flooding through her with the inevitability of dawn. The exhaustion she'd been fighting for weeks suddenly seemed overwhelming. The weight of responsibility, the endless nights, the isolation of being the only guardian in these quiet halls. It would be so easy to simply give in, to let someone else share the burden. When the day shift arrived the next morning, they found Rina's station abandoned. Her reports were complete, every patient accounted for, but she was nowhere to be found. Security cameras showed her making her final rounds at exactly 3 in the morning, but the footage became strangely distorted whenever she approached room 305. The new night nurse who replaced Rina lasted exactly 1 week before requesting a transfer. She reported hearing footsteps in the corridor, seeing figures in white moving just outside her peripheral vision, and above all, the sound that now came not from room 305, but from multiple locations throughout the floor. 2 sets of 3 knocks, soft and measured, always at 3 in the morning. Some say that if you walk the 3rd floor of Ioba General Hospital during the quiet hours before dawn, you might catch a glimpse of 2 nurses making their eternal rounds. They move with the practiced efficiency of those who have found their true calling, checking on patients who sleep peacefully under their watchful care, ensuring that no one suffers alone in the darkness. The hospital administration has never officially acknowledged what happened to Rina Takahashi. Her employment records simply note that she completed her final shift and did not return. But the nursing staff knows better. They understand that some people find their purpose so completely that not even death can separate them from their duty. And on those rare nights when the hospital feels especially quiet, when the fluorescent lights seem dimmer, and the corridors stretch longer than they should, staff members report hearing something that both comforts and chills them. The sound of gentle knocking, always 3 times, always polite, always patient. The eternal rounds of nurses who loved their work too much to ever truly leave. Thanks for joining me tonight for another journey into Japan's most haunting real experiences. What do you think really happened to Rina? Let me know in the comments below, and remember, the next time you're alone in a quiet building at 3 in the morning, pay attention to the sounds around you. Sometimes those who care for others never really stop making their rounds.